All right, welcome everyone. Hopefully you can hear my microphone. Welcome to our Fireside chat today with Noel Kinder, Chief Sustainability Officer of Nike. We're so excited to learn about Noel's journey and especially about how his time in the Peace Corps and nonprofits shaped his perspective in various leadership roles at Nike around the world. My name is Catherine Wendell, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility, CSER, at the Leeds School of Business. And down here to moderate with me is Renner Skidmore, Leeds undergraduate student, CSER Advisory Board member, and professional skier.
Hello, everyone. So there's that.
Who has a film tomorrow night. Yeah, we can talk about that at the reception.
If you're in the skiing, but.
Okay, so just a quick note before we get started. Unfortunately, our QR code just decided to stop working. It was working about an hour ago. However, you can still use the FeedBio app and just type in the number that you see down there. We're not sure if we'll have time for Q&A after the conversation, but if we do have time, we'll definitely cover one or two questions from the audience that were voted to the top. So, Noel, you lead Nike's efforts to protect the planet, and we want to learn more about Nike's sustainability journey for sure. But first, we want to know your journey and how did you get to this point? So I'd love to hear more about your childhood and if there was an aspect of your childhood that shaped the decisions that you made later in life, which included volunteering as a Peace Corps volunteer, which we'll talk about in a few minutes.
I feel like there's a joke in here somewhere, but I'm going to just go right past it. So I actually was, hi everybody, thank you for coming. I'm flattered that you all wanted to take your Thursday evening to hang out and listen to me prattle on. I will make shameless plugs for the Peace Corps. There's a recruitment desk out there. But in the meantime, in the spirit of answering the question, I was raised by two hippies. My parents were shameless hippies, as a matter of fact. And so that, no question, had an impact on kind of how I saw the world. When I was a kid, my mom and dad would drag my brother and I out into the Cascade Range, the Coast Range of Oregon, in the pouring rain in the fall to hunt mushrooms. We both thought they were insane. In hindsight, it was probably a pretty formative experience. But just kind of that ethos of being aware of your surroundings, taking care of it, understanding kind of the impact that you have on the world. We camped a ton. And then I went to Oregon. So I won't rub it in your face that Oregon beat the Buffs a couple of weeks ago. Just gloss right over that. That hurts. We could talk about Washington and Oregon later. But, Oregon in the early 90s was a pretty liberal place, to say the least. And so I think I was a sociology undergrad, so I spent a lot of time on social theory. It's somewhat ironic that I work for who I work for now and have for 24 years, that I was studying Marx and Durkheim and Weber as an undergrad. But I do think that helped me really have a passion for, finding a way to have impact at scale. At the time, when I was an early undergrad, there was an issue that some of you probably aren't even aware of around an endangered species in Oregon. Oregon's economy was really rooted in the logging industry for a really long time. And there was a species called the spotted owl. And that was an incredibly divisive topic at the time. And I had the chance to listen to kind of both sides of the issue through my undergrad. And it really kind of dawned on me that if you started to understand the root of some of these issues, that you actually might be able to find a middle ground, that you might be able to build some bridges, and then again, ultimately have an impact at scale. So I worked at a small publishing company for a couple of years after I graduated from U of O. And then I decided I wanted to be a Peace Corps volunteer. And that was really driven by the fact that my father was the son of a career expat. So he had lived in Pakistan and Hong Kong and Australia. And so I grew up with all these artifacts from him living all over the world. So I kind of knew that was something I wanted to do at some point. And so I decided that Peace Corps was going to be the way that I was going to do that. After a very long process, I don't think it's nearly as long from an application standpoint as it was then, I wound up in Honduras. With my friend Max Boykoff, who leads the School of Environmental Studies. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So you have Max to thank for introducing me to Catherine and getting me here. But that's an incredibly formative experience. You're in the middle of nowhere, and at the time, Honduras was the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. living way outside of your comfort zone, trying to operate in a language that you don't speak particularly well, getting used to, the food was actually pretty good, but bugs, scorpions, cockroaches, chickens walking into your house, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the thing that really continued to kind of reinforce that notion of wanting to have an impact was just kind of the fundamental lack of infrastructure in a place like that, right? There was an evening, we'd get these big rainstorms during the rainy season. There was a dirt kind of gravel road out in front of the house that I lived in, which was adjacent to the landlord's house. And I'd spent a lot of time with them, and she had 2 little kids. Big storm coming down the dirt road, and she takes her son's diaper and tosses it out into the torrent right down the street. And I was like, what are you doing? She's like, well, where else am I going to put it? And this was a disposable diaper. And I just kind of went, oh, yeah. Okay. The temperatures in that part of the country were 2 degrees C higher than the rest of the country because it had been so deforested. Well, the reason it had been deforested is because they used firewood to cook their food. So you start to see the interrelation between the way people live their lives, the economic situation, the lack of infrastructure, and the impact on the environment. Long story short, Hurricane Mitch happened, which prior to Katrina was the worst hurricane in the Western Hemisphere. Max and I were evacuated. Max and his wife, Monica, were also evacuated. And I decided to go back to the US. I managed a gang intervention nonprofit for about 6 months, believe it or not. There are Latino gangs outside of Portland. And then I randomly ran into a friend of mine who had been a fraternity brother at U of O. And when I had gone into the Peace Corps, he'd gone into the Marine Corps. We literally bumped into each other on the street in Northwest Portland, hadn't seen each other in 5 years. We were living across the street from each other with our fiancés, and he asked me to be in his wedding. His mom had been at Nike since it was Blue Ribbon Sports, so well before I'd had a swoosh, anything like that. And she said, hey, what are you up to? And I said, well, I'm kind of looking for a job. I'm getting ready to get married. Being a part-time executive director of a nonprofit is probably not going to work from an income standpoint. And so ultimately, she hired me to be a quality analyst in footwear. I knew nothing about quality or footwear, but I was working for a company that I'd grown up with in my backyard. My dad was a runner. He had run in Nikes since I was, old enough to remember it. We could never afford them, so I didn't get to have them. But it was an iconic brand even in 1999. And so over the course of my career, I've been really fortunate to have. I like to describe myself as a bit of a mud from a career standpoint. I started in footwear quality. I got kind of intellectually bored when I was doing that. Went back, I got my MBA at Portland State while I was still working at Nike. For those of you that are considering getting an MBA, don't do it the year that your oldest child is born. It's a really big burden. I think she appreciates it now, but it was tough at the time. So I finished that, and I wound up doing some finance, some strategic planning, some more strategic planning, and then I kind of got into a position where I could flex that muscle of wanting to exercise maybe a greater impact on the world through what I was doing. And I was given a job that at the time was called the Senior Director of Apparel Sourcing and Supply Planning. It's a very corporate term, isn't it? But anyway, in simple terms, that team's job was to identify the factories that were going to make our apparel and make the decisions as to how much volume we were going to give them. And one of the things that we did during that course of time, and I'm sorry, if I'm going off script, you can stop me, but one of the things we did at the time was to start to evaluate not just the really important KPIs like cost, quality, delivery, but we factored in sustainability into our decision-making too. And you and I were talking about this before we came in, but I think that was probably the first time that I went, oh, this is how it can work. You can actually do all of these things together. Now, Nike's somewhat unique. Nobody in this room is unaware of our history. So we had a little bit of a head start in terms of the mentality to integrate those things into the way that we made decisions. But to be able to evaluate all those criteria as co-equal when your job was really to place orders with factories was really inspiring to me. So I did that job for about 2.5 years, and then I was asked to be the GM of Nike Vietnam, which if you haven't been to Vietnam, I highly recommend you go. It's one of the most amazing countries on the planet. In fact, Alan, who's the Peace Corps recruiter, was just telling me that Vietnam has been approved as a Peace Corps country, which is amazing.
That's great.
And so I was the general manager of footwear manufacturing. So I managed, at the time, 14 factories that made 50% of Nike's footwear. Everything from quality to delivery to costing to engineering to, you can imagine what it looked like. We were remodeling the office at the same time. TPP was actually still on the table, which for those of you that don't know, that was a massive trade deal that the Trump administration killed the day that they started. So I did a lot of government relations. And again, it kind of reinforced that notion that the higher you go, the more impact you can have. And there were days that factories would do dumb things, usually not on purpose. And I would have to spend a significant amount of time talking with the general managers of these factories about kind of reinforcing our expectations and working with them to correct things. So that was really inspiring too.
And go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, I'll take a breath.
So you're saying that like the higher you go up, the more impact you can have. But as an undergrad or even an MBA student, we're starting at lower level positions in all types of industries. How do you incorporate that environmental passion or your hippie upbringing into like making a change and making positive impact if you're going into historically industries that aren't that good, or Nike where you joined when there was a reputation of poor labor practices and that type of stuff?
You said shady manufacturing.
Shady manufacturing, yes.
We were talking a couple of weeks ago, I mean, you have to pick the right company. You have to have, you and I were talking about this beforehand too, that when you go to work for somebody, and this is something you care about, you have to make sure they care about it too. You can't go into an organization that is like, well, we'll comply when we have to from a regulatory standpoint. It has to be part of their purpose. And that's not to say you won't have to make trade-offs. You absolutely will. I mean, we were talking about the MBA program before we got started. That's part of an MBA is what are the trade-offs you have to make? There's no question about that. But you really have to start with what is the company, what's the ethos in the company? And then, and I get this question a lot from our own employees, is like, hey, look, I work in IT or I work in merchandising and my title doesn't have sustainability in it. What do I do? There are some jobs that you just don't have that much impact, and that's okay. Good companies will create opportunities for you. So for example, we did effectively a contest pre-COVID that allowed people to submit ideas that were sustainability at scale. So there were recycling programs in the distribution centers, getting away from using corrugate entirely in Japan and using reusable totes to move product between distribution centers and retail doors, those kinds of things. And I think that's super helpful too. And then you kind of find your people. There's a club at Nike, the Nike Sustainability Club, that's self-organized. It's 400 employees that they don't necessarily have an impact on sustainability, but they care about it, and they get together and they talk about what they can do in their daily lives. I spend some time with them. They give me ideas. So you have to be a little resourceful, but you have to start with a company that aligns with your values.
And so, Noel, in 2016, you mentioned you became the Vice President of Sustainable Manufacturing and Sourcing at Nike, and you were responsible for Nike's labor and environmental footprint in 550 contract factories in 42 countries. So what you did impacted over 1 million workers. So think about all those jobs, think about the livelihoods of all the families affected by that. Can you talk about what it was like to walk into some of the factories where Nike apparel was made at the time? And we talked about what your experience was. And
yeah, I mean, it was apparel and footwear.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you that I have never walked into a factory that has made product for Nike and been ashamed to be there. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to name a competitor, but I have walked into a competitor's factory that unfortunately was owned by a group that we did business with that I thought was the definition of a sweatshop. Mm-hmm. The industry has a long ways to go still to this day. And frankly, what we went through even before I got there was a catalyst for us to be where we are at this moment. That does not mean that on any given day there are things that happen in the supply chain that are violations of our code of conduct or shouldn't happen. But I think what I learned was, number one, and this is especially true for all you MBA students, who you do business with matters. How you select the partners that you work with, and do you treat them as partners or do you treat them as transactional relationships? That makes a huge difference. And I think I understood that philosophically at the time, but when you've been in business with somebody for 20, or in some cases, in our case, 50 years, you have a history of ups and downs, good, bad. You clearly align on your values. So when something goes wrong, you have the basis to address it mutually. If it's just transactional and you're going for lowest cost, that's a lot harder to drive change. And so I think that was the thing that I really came away with from that experience.
Right. And didn't you, I think you mentioned when we had the conversation on the call that when you saw things that you didn't like in a factory, you would sometimes adjust their order and maybe decrease the order from that particular factory.
Right.
but being mindful of all the jobs that are being impacted. And,
That's right.
and that's another example of these trade-offs. And what was that like?
Yeah, and that really started when I was in the apparel job, and we had these criteria that we evaluated performance on. And so price, quality, delivery, and sustainability. And sustainability in that context really meant, do they comply with our code of conduct? Are they doing all the things that we expect them to from a human rights standpoint? Are they paying people on time? Are they not forcing overtime? Is the minimum age being complied with? Are they doing all the things from an environmental standpoint that they're supposed to be doing? They have wastewater treatment. They're not throwing stuff effluent where they're not supposed to. That's job number one. When partners would have issues with that, they'd have a violation of the code of conduct that showed up in an audit, we'd have a conversation with them and we set up a remediation plan. There are effectively two variables when you have a manufacturing partner in our industry that has a problem like that. Do they have the capacity to fix the issue, and do they want to fix the issue? Usually they have, at least in our case now, that may not have been true 25 years ago, they do want to fix it. They know what the expectations are. Sometimes they don't have the capability. Right? You're talking about developing countries with different standards. Sometimes you're talking about 3 different languages in the same conversation. Could be Bahasa in Indonesia, owned by a Korean factory with Nike team speaking English at the same time. So that's a significant dynamic as well. But to your point, if the issue is significant enough, we reduce their orders. But the challenge is when you reduce their orders, you're putting financial strain on them. If you're putting financial strain on them, you're potentially putting the workforce at risk. And so oftentimes what happens is, in any controversial issue, you want to gravitate toward the black and the white. Just cutting a factory because they have a performance issue is really detrimental to their workforce. Unfortunately, there have been situations that I've seen, not only from my own vantage point, but even my peers in other companies, where you have some relationships that are so damaged and the capability and the desire is not there that ultimately it results in ending the relationship.
So speaking of relationships and kind of the motivations of people who want to do good, as a corporation and a primary mission of serving shareholders, do you feel like the board of directors at Nike and the investors actually want to promote your agenda and sustainability, or does it feel like something you can leverage with consumers in order to make your company more profitable?
That's a great question. I think it's both, actually. So Nike's a little bit unique in the boardroom. Because of our history, we have a corporate responsibility committee that's existed on the board for 25 years.
Wow,
I get the pleasure of talking to them every quarter. Yeah. I'll talk to them again in November. And their primary job in this space is twofold. Number one, we always have a conversation about how our factories are doing relative to our code of conduct. What's the compliance rate? If there are problems, why are there problems? So that's always a specific conversation. And then about every third meeting, we talk about our other sustainability targets and how we're progressing against those. So the board is very mindful of that because they're outward commitments that we've made. Interestingly, and we talked about this before as well, investors are really tuned into this. So Nike, for those of you that pay attention, is largely owned by big institutional investors. Phil Knight still has a lot of shares, but we're talking BlackRock, Fidelity, Wellington, State Street. These are massive corporations, right? And most of them have either an ESG or what they call a stewardship group. And their entire job is to look at the companies that they own in their portfolio and evaluate how we're doing in this space. They read our impact report front to back. They often know it better than our executives do. I probably have 6 to 8 calls with them a year, talking through questions that they may have that are relative to what's happening right now, what's happening in the impact report, where do we see our trajectory, whether it's carbon reduction or things that happen in the supply chain.
And are they focused mainly on risk management, or do they see that a lot of young people, Gen Zers, your consumers, really care deeply about sustainability, or is it a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. And the example that I point to, I think it's still up. The shoe that's in the back is the Infinity. It's made with a foam called React X. And to me, we actually had this conversation with our CEO and his leadership team on Tuesday. That's the definition of where we need to go as a company, because I think that's what, and you guys can check me when we're done if I'm assuming your intentions correctly, but I think that's what our consumer wants. And what I mean by that is it's a performance running shoe. It's intended to rival Hawkeye or On. It is made using more sustainable material. So the textile on the top is made using recycled content. And the foam, that React X, is 40% less carbon intensive than its predecessor, which means that it's got a lower carbon footprint, right, overall. But at the end of the day, if you're a runner, you want to buy it because it's a good running shoe, and it's a nice little kicker that it's more sustainable. So I think that's where the sweet spot is for us as a brand, is that you still have to be a performance brand and you need to be more sustainable.
Right, right.
Awesome. Well, another product we'd like to talk a little about is the Space Hippon line. And we actually have a video that we'd like to show for that to give a little introduction. There you go. Sweet.
Ourselves.
You'd be crazy not to have anxiety around climate change right now.
We have this optimistic urgency that we have to get after things.
We are on a journey to make the most sustainable shoe ever.
We have been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to reduce our carbon footprint.
A lot of companies have it now, but we were probably one of the first.
We kept going back to this phrase called in situ utilization.
There's this idea in space exploration that if you're going to fly to the moon, fly to Mars, and stay there and do something, you have to create things with what you find there. Say there's no resupply mission coming to Mars, there's no resupply mission coming to Earth either.
Noah came in, one of the great insights he had was, hey, what do we have laying around?
What if waste becomes our future feedstock? What if it is actually the material that we use?
And that's really where the idea of Space Hippon was born out of.
We just started grabbing different things we already had and putting them together. We were looking at everything and saying, oh, it's like super spacey, but it's also really rough. There was something about it that was so different than anything I had seen us doing.
It made our factory partners very nervous.
Hey, are you serious? Are we gonna really making the shoes like that?
When they look weird, it's because they're made of trash.
We are working on what it means to create a fully closed-loop economy.
Reuse of materials so that we aren't causing more damage to the planet.
Sustainability at Nike, though, is not new. We divert over 1 billion plastic bottles a year.
And so there's this duality of high performance but low impact.
If we don't start now doing something, then we might not have that future to actually get to.
Our job is also to help protect the future of sport.
Our job is to leave the world a better place.
Great. So these sneakers are trashed. Tell us more about how this came to be, and yeah, how your team collaborated, I think, to make this happen.
Yeah. So we're really fortunate to have a pretty powerful innovation team in the company. I mean, I think over the last 52 years, Nike's really prided itself on innovation. And there's a team within that team called the Space Team. Noah, who you saw, the bald guy with the goatee and beard, he came up with this idea that he wanted to see if we could make the lowest carbon footprint shoe we've ever made. And they really quickly arrived at the conclusion that you had to use recycled material to do it. There are lots of nascent materials out there that are really cool, and we could talk about those too. But to get to something at scale, you really had to use recycled content. And so, because it was a bit of a science experiment, they really kind of leaned into this rough aesthetic. It's certainly not for everybody. They're super comfortable if you can even find them anymore. But I think it was a pretty catalytic moment, because I think it proved that something that was a little bit of a science experiment, we really didn't have much expectation for it from a commercial standpoint. We didn't put any brand dollars behind it. Absolutely took off. I still see them to this day. And I've been told by people that I've talked to about it that they bought 5 pairs of them because they love them so much. So I think we stumbled onto something that's really insightful from a product creation and design standpoint that resonated with consumers.
Mm-hmm. So 2 follow-up questions from that. One is, like, when you're recycling a bunch of materials, what's the energy footprint from that process? And then the other one is, how does that actually feed into your sustainability targets as an overall corporation?
So what's interesting about recycled content is that you're amortizing the carbon footprint over multiple uses, which is why it's lower, right? So if you take recycled polyester, right, that's probably the most common recycled material out there. The reason that it's lower carbon is that you're just using it over and over again, right? So yeah, there's some energy that it takes to actually recycle it, but it pales in comparison to the kind of the overall diminished carbon footprint. So we have a couple targets that this feeds into. We have some very specific targets around waste, including one that specifically calls out recycling our own waste for use in our own products.
These are your 2025.
These are our 2025
goals.
targets,
okay.
yeah.
Great. Great.
And then, like I said, part of the way that we get to achieving the carbon targets that we have now is by using more recycled content. So the faster we can use recycled content, the faster we drive down our carbon targets.
And what are your other targets? Your sustainability
You're going to make me recite all 13. I'll give them to you, yeah, by impact area. So we have 3 carbon targets. We have a carbon reduction target for our owned and operated footprint, which is basically adoption of renewable energy, and our what you would call scope 3 as well, so our manufacturing logistics footprint. And then we have a materials adoption target. So to your point, Renner, the more we adopt the right materials, the faster our carbon target goes down. So maybe I'll pause on that for a second, because for Nike, and this is true at VF or any apparel company, you basically have 2 things that drive your carbon footprint: the materials you use and what they're made out of, and the energy that it takes to convert those to products. Transportation's in there, but it's not nearly as big as those other 2. Waste, so we have some targets around reducing the amount of waste that we produce in the first place, recycle content back into our own products, and then actually offering consumers ways to dispose of their product rather than throwing them in the trash. We have some water targets that are both reduction of water per kilo of textiles produced, which we continue to overachieve, which is awesome, and also water restoration. We have some chemistry targets, so actually eliminating, there's actually 10 different chemistries that we've targeted to eliminate. I cannot recite them, so I won't even try. And then we have targets in the labor space, which is compliance with our code of conduct, employee engagement, gender equity, and I'm missing one. I'm missing the 13th one. But if you go to Nike's impact report, you can see how we're doing on all of those. Awesome.
And how do you go about communicating your progress towards your sustainability targets to consumers, to your board of directors?
Yeah, so I mentioned the board of directors earlier. Like every quarter, we go and talk about specifically the compliance with the code of conduct. Every third meeting, we go into a deep dive on all those targets. So I'll do that in November. Investors, we do kind of a big investor engagement period, usually in the spring. And they're probably one of the biggest constituents right now. Consumers is a little tougher. If I were to talk to you about the virtues of eliminating coal-fired boilers in the textile industry, might be interesting to those of you in the room, but kind of hard to process for your average consumer, right? If you walk into a Nike shop or a Dick's or something like that, and you see a Space Hippon on the wall, being able to trying to tell that story is really hard. And so I think that's something that we still kind of struggle with, is to, in a sharp, concise, understandable way, can communicate to all of you what we're doing in a meaningful way without making you go read our impact report.
So it's relatively easy to set targets. And then what happens when you don't achieve them? And really, what more needs to be done? Because I'm sure when you look at your targets, I would think that some are easier to reach than others. And so when you feel like you're struggling to reach one, what happens, or what are the challenges associated with reaching your targets?
How long do we have? I mean, you're talking like massive systemic change, right? Well, let's just focus on scope 3 emissions.
Sure.
So our scope 3 emissions, like I said, come largely from materials, the feedstock and the materials, the textile dyeing and finishing process, so the heat that it takes to actually fire up these boilers, spin the materials, throw the materials in a boiler, dye them, et cetera. And then finished goods manufacturing, so the power that it takes to do that. The only way you solve that is through influencing. So having conversations with governments in Vietnam and Indonesia to increase their adoption of renewable energy. You want to do energy efficiency things too, and of course there's a business incentive for the factories to do that because they're more efficient, they use less power, they make more money. But it gets really tough when you're dependent on grids in those places to actually achieve your targets. So in that case, you lean in harder, right? You find other industries that have the same goals. You leverage your government relationships. You talk to anybody who's willing to listen about why it's important, and hope that they agree with you.
Do you see developing that infrastructure in places where you manufacture as a big part of your role in creating a future for all?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, when I was in Vietnam, Nike's business indirectly, because we don't own any factories, was not quite 2% of GDP.
Wow.
I don't think it's that anymore, but that demonstrates the impact that you have at a place like that. And so, it gives you some influence for sure. I think in that case, what you're trying to do is not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's quite as flowery as you described it. That's not criticism. But it's more about, hey, collectively, we all know that this is the way that we need to go. We have a relationship with the Vietnamese government because we're so big there. As part of that conversation, we say, hey, our factories have a desire to have access to more renewable energy. Would you be willing to look at your regulatory framework to allow power purchasing agreements or things that are more common in Europe and the US? And so that's kind of the way that we approach it.
So while we're talking about different ways to approach the issue of sustainability and social responsibility, what are some important skills for students like us to develop while we're at university so we can take on these challenges when we enter the workforce?
The single biggest thing that you have to do in a job like mine is influence, because you don't really own anything, right? You're trying to get the logistics team to operate differently. Sometimes you're trying to get, I'll give you an example that was probably 4 years old. Get the North America retail team to stop using the giant orange plastic bags that we use forever, because they have like 1,000-year half-life, and use paper instead. And so that requires you to know a little bit about the business. And so my recommendation would be, and I'm maybe skipping to a question we were talking about earlier, learn as much as you can about the businesses that you work for. How do they make money? What's their supply chain look like? What are the intersections of incentive between what you want to do from a sustainability standpoint and how the company, what their cash flow is, how they operate, et cetera. Because when you find those intersections of incentive, that's when you actually get things done.
And I did want to ask a question around that. I'd like to take a moment just to explore the tension, right, that often exists between business growth and sustainable development. And yes, we can have both. We must have both, but it's often difficult to achieve, and it doesn't often come naturally. It requires people like Noel who are influencing and talking to other people and really coming up with a strategy to align goals. And so we're at the business school. We're actually technically in engineering in this room, but at the business school, I'm an anthropologist by training. I know Noel mentioned he studies sociology, but we've been entrenched in business for a while. And we understand, we talked about this, we live in a capitalist system where corporations have a primary mission of serving their shareholders and generating profits. And on the positive side, we know that as capitalism has flourished and markets have liberalized over the past 25 years, that over 1 billion people around the world have lifted themselves out of poverty, according to the World Bank. And, since I was a Peace Corps volunteer, you were a Peace Corps volunteer, we know what it's like for people living in poverty. And that's a big deal to have jobs and to be lifted out of poverty. The downsides, of course, wearing my anthropologist hat, and I know this is a question that Matt Burgess of the Center for Social and Environmental Futures over in Environmental Studies, he wanted me to ask. We recognize there are downsides. There are externalities associated with the capitalist system, such as climate change. Yeah. There are wicked problems like income inequality that the market struggles to solve. And so there really is this tension. And Nike obviously is growth-oriented. Nike is, as we mentioned, the largest or the world's largest athletic footwear and apparel company with a market cap that is larger than 3/4 of the countries around the world. Yeah. Think about that. Think about that power and influence. And Nike plans to grow, right? It's growth-oriented, which generates more profits, more wealth, but also more exacerbated externalities, potentially more wicked problems. And so this is the big question, I think, that I get a lot, that I struggle with. It involves trade-offs, but really, how do you think about this, Noel? And how do Nike's sustainability goals fit within this growth-oriented framework? I mean, can you have profits and prosperity over the longer term, and how do you achieve both? Because it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I mean that's the big question. How do you reconcile a growth agenda with the job that I have to do?
Right.
Look, I think I'd probably cry in my soup every night if I wasn't optimistic about it. One of the things that makes me the most optimistic is that I get to work with our innovation team a lot, and there are an infinite number of materials, technological innovations in the sustainability space that give me hope that those things can coexist. If you had asked me that question 3 years ago, I probably would have pointed to Space Hippon as an example. Super early example, but being able to use waste as a feedstock for your own product, that's like the most capitalist thing you can do, and probably one of the more sustainable things you can do. Fast forward to today, actually a friend of mine who just left Nike just became the CEO of a company in the Netherlands called Corium, and they're growing leather from collagen.
Wow.
You and I were talking about another example that I think I can talk about. I guess we're recording it, but we have a partnership with a company called New Light. They actually capture methane from defunct coal mines and pig farms, and they feed it to a naturally occurring bacteria that they draw out of the Pacific Ocean, and the precipitate that comes out of it, you can make plastic out of. So because methane is so much more intense of a greenhouse gas than CO2 is, if you incorporate that into products, it actually makes them carbon negative if you make them in the right way. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's always the tension in this system is companies that are publicly listed are incentivized for growth, quarter on quarter on quarter. Stock price is down, right? The offense pivots to how are we going to make more money? How are we going to be more profitable? How do we grow? But I do think that there's been this sea change, and frankly, those of you sitting in the room are a big catalyst for this. I've got a 20-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 15-year-old. When I was their age, I wouldn't have been caught dead in thrifted clothes because that was an admission of poverty. Today, my 20-year-old's favorite fit is 2 things that she thrifted at Goodwill and a pair of Air Force Ones. So I think that the mentality has shifted tremendously, and those things will always live in tension. But I think that we've finally figured out that one doesn't have to dominate the other.
Well, I think we could probably move on to some audience questions at this point.
Yeah, sure. I guess I had one more question right before we open it up to the audience. And Julie has some.
Yeah, it is.
So just getting back to the Peace Corps, kind of where you started, where you are now. I was a Peace Corps volunteer as well in Ecuador from 2002 to 2004. I'm happy to talk about it if anyone wants to stop by Caesar's office. How do you feel like being a Peace Corps volunteer maybe opened up some doors for you in your career journey, or gave you a perspective that was really valuable to you in rising through the ranks at Nike?
Well, I think it helps you connect with people, right? You have to learn how to do that when you're in the environment that we're in those situations. It certainly helped me adapt to living in Vietnam a lot faster. I had been to Vietnam a million times before I'd moved there, but living there was very different than just going there for a business trip. I think it makes you more empathetic. It helps you understand that your worldview isn't the only worldview. And when you work in a company the size of Nike, you're working with 83,999 other people who all have different perspectives. And so your job is, and this is true whether you're in an influencing job like mine, or you're in some cases, the CEO, you still have to find the intersection of incentive with the people around you. And I think Peace Corps does a really good job of that. You're dropped into an environment that you are incredibly uncomfortable in, and you have to find your way.
Right. I'm curious, is anyone in the audience thinking of being a Peace Corps volunteer? Raise your hand. A few. Okay, well, we'd like to inspire more of you. There's
hopefully that number goes up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the motto used to be, it's the toughest job you'll ever love, and it was really one of the highlights of my life, so I'd highly recommend it.
Seriously, yeah.
I've got one question about the intersection of incentive you've been talking about. To what extent is that similar to meeting people's needs and finding out what a need is and being able to match that with the company's needs?
Yep. So I'll give you an anecdotal response. When I first got into this job, a guy named Michael Spillane was the president of product. Michael is a Bostonian. He's got super dry affect. And I'm sitting in his office, and I'm all excited about this new job. And I'm like, we could do this. And he goes, look, we got a million things to do every season. Sustainability is like 1,005,000th on the list. And I was like, oh, okay. Long story short, as the conversation went on, we decided that we were going to focus on waste. Because in a footwear apparel product creation engine, waste is the enemy of margin growth. So anything you leave on the cutting room floor is lost profit. So that's what I mean by the intersection of incentive. Waste, the more you waste, the higher your carbon footprint is, the more you're putting into the waste stream, and oh, by the way, you're making less money. And so there's definitely a maturity curve for companies in their sustainability journey. And the early wins are usually finding those intersections of incentive. I won't lie, it gets harder the more mature you are.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let's take a question from the audience.
No.
No.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah.
We had a lot of great questions come in, but the most popular one so far is, how is Nike tackling biodiversity, and how do you think that biodiversity will come into play with the future of sustainability
That's
work?
such a great question. The biodiversity is one of the, sustainability is a little bit of its own echo chamber sometimes. And so you get terms like TCFD, which effectively was what the SEC is going to wind up doing. Biodiversity is kind of the term du jour. We're already doing a lot in the biodiversity space. And what I would call out is a couple things. Two things that we're doing in water. So water restoration. The textile industry uses a ton of water, as you can imagine. So water restoration is really important. That's kind of mitigating the damage that's been done. The better work is actually reduction of water usage. And again, that kind of goes back to your question about intersection of incentive. If I'm a textile mill and I can use less water, that means that I have better first time through quality, meaning that I don't have to run the batches through multiple times, which means that I'm not using as much energy, as much water, and I'm more profitable. So those are the two areas that we focused on for our 2025 goals. That we're taking a wider look at that going forward, and a lot of it has to do with the feedstocks we use for our materials, right? So polyester, even if recycled, started out as oil. Is there a bio PET out there that could be a substitute for it? So we're starting to think through that as well.
Thank you. Okay, next question. I will summarize. We see things like the Space Hippon line, these great new shoes here on the screen, but the majority, it would seem, of Nike products are Jordans and shoes like that. Wouldn't it be more impactful to make changes to those products? And are changes happening? It seems like maybe not, but we just don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is the inherent other tension that our consumers will say that sustainability is really important to them, but then they'll buy Air Force Ones or AJ Ones or Dunk, which are the most carbon intensive shoes we have. And the tension that exists is there are substitute materials for those things, but they want full grain leather. And so the challenge is, it ultimately winds up being an innovation challenge. How do you find a material that is what the consumer wants, that is more sustainable, that they won't go, oh, that's cheaper, that's not what I want. Because no one's going to buy a product that underperforms their expectations just because it's more sustainable. So yes, we're working on it. Those are tough models to crack. They're really heavy. They use a lot of energy to produce them, and they use some really crappy materials because they use a lot of leather.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. How are you thinking about the upcoming EPR Textile Bill in California and other states?
That's a great question. I don't know the details of EPR in California. I'm more familiar with what's going to happen in the EU. I mean, it is what it is. We'll comply with it. What I think is an advantage for us is that we've been doing, we've had a program called Nike Grind or Reuse a Shoe for 30 plus years at this point. It's small. I'll be totally honest. It's not tens of millions of pairs. It's a few million pairs. But we have figured out that you can take post-consumer waste or post-industrial waste, like factory floor scrap, and incorporate it into other products. So you can go to Home Depot and buy carpet padding that has Nike Grind in it. So I think we've proven to ourselves that we'll be okay. I think the trickier thing is actually refurbishment, repair, those kinds of things, because the repair in particular requires an infrastructure that doesn't exist right now.
I think a larger point there is that I've heard from a number of company leaders is that regulations is driving this to a great deal. Would you agree with that in terms of the emerging regulations, the SEC, what's happening in Europe?
Yeah, no question. The SEC is taking their sweet time getting to whatever they're going to do, but the EU is not waiting.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think because of our history, because of the infrastructure that we've built around reporting and being willing to show our homework, we're collectively feeling like we're in pretty good shape to comply. But inevitably, there'll be things that we have to build.
One question on that. As there's more regulation, more demand for the sustainable aspects of business, do you see more jobs developing within your department in Nike?
I actually don't think they'll come in my team. I think they'll come in like data and analytics, controlling. We were talking about kind of the intersection between finance and accounting and carbon. I think that's where you're going to see the growth. You know, as I talk to our legal team, as they talk to their peers in other companies or outside counsel, most companies have no idea what they're going to do. So there's going to be a huge demand for consultants, for accountants, for controlling people, for people that kind of understand the intersections between the business functions and sustainability, which is rare right now.
And just a quick plug for Caesar, our center, is that we help students differentiate. So, for instance, if you're studying accounting, we do carbon accounting workshops so that you get that extra skill that's going to make you stand out when you're applying for a job at a company like Nike. Or if you're a finance major, you can learn sustainable finance and learn how to manage climate risk. And would you agree that these skills are going to be
absolutely important? Do that and then go in the Peace Corps.
Great. Another question from the audience? Great.
So as Nike's Chief Sustainability Officer, what is your ultimate sustainability goal that you wish to implement at Nike? And what is your primary motivation for this?
I would feel really good if we hit our science-based carbon reduction target because it's incredibly ambitious. So science-based target is basically you commit to a target that's in line with the Paris Climate Accord. So less than 2 degrees C. For a growth company, to your early call out, that's really hard because it's an absolute target. It's not a per unit target. You're reducing your absolute carbon footprint, in our case, by 30% across every scope by 2030. You're already seeing companies back off of their targets. Amazon backed off of theirs. Crocs pushed theirs out 10 years. There are companies that, in my opinion, made commitments when it was really in vogue to make a commitment without really knowing how they were going to get there. And now they're having the oh shit moment where they're going, wow, we have to completely transform the company in order to get there. We had a really specific conversation in front of our board committee that we would not commit to targets that we couldn't see our way toward 80%-ish of what it would take to achieve it. So we knew what we were signing up for. It doesn't make it easy, but if we could get to that, that would be a massive achievement for a company like us.
And for companies who are kind of backing down off of those goals, do you see, like as an executive in sustainability, do you see a path back to recovering from that back down at all?
It depends on what kind of pressure they get. You know, if their investors start to pressure them, if their employees start to pressure them, then yeah, I do. If everybody just kind of blows it off, then maybe not, right? A lot of those things depend on what external pressures you face and increasingly what internal pressures you face.
And for external pressures, because most of us at this point are consumers, is the consumer pressure, is that enough, or do you need to have the investor and employee pressure as well?
I think you need all three. Yeah, the investor pressure is real. I mean, the CEOs, the CFOs, the CSOs all have to talk to investors. And if they don't like what they see, they'll continue to put pressure on them. Employees are a really powerful voice. I mean, you can always just infer what's happening from the outside, but Amazon had 5,000 employees sign a letter saying that they didn't feel like Amazon was doing enough. And no disrespect to Kara Hurst, who's my peer there. She does amazing work at a really complex company. But it's just an example of how the employee voice matters in the equation.
Have you had something similar happen at Nike? Or?
No, we're so far ahead of it that we never got that.
Great. Maybe one or two more questions from the audience. Great.
What do you think is the role of collaboration in the sustainability space between brands that are often competitors but have overlapping supply chains?
It's really, really important. No question about it. Nike's not going to solve Vietnam's power grid by itself. That we have a significant footprint there, but the Vietnamese government cares a little about what we say, but they care a lot more about what foreign investment says as a collective voice. So in Vietnam, we've been part of a cross-industry collaboration that's echoed a point of view. We have industry collaborations with our direct competitors on a number of things, including codes of compliance in the supply chain. So it's a relatively new phenomena, I think just within the last probably 5 years, but it's the only way you solve problems that are this big and complex.
Great, maybe one more.
So next one.
Not on.
There seems.
No, it was.
There seems to be a growing feeling
Amongst, I'm just going to say it.
Okay.
There seems to be a growing feeling amongst consumers and students that ESG is simply a marketing tool for a toothless promise. How do you combat that?
That's right, greenwashing, and if you could talk about green hushing as well.
Green hushing, yeah. That ESG is a toothless tool. Yeah, it's a great question. I kind of put it in the same bucket of what I said earlier, that there was a period when I first came into this job, everybody was committing to net zero. Like that was the thing that you were going to do. And like I said, there was a reckoning it's been happening over the last couple of years where companies are realizing that those claims are really hard to live up to. You see a lot more legal action. A number of companies have gotten sued because consumers have said that they're not living up to their promise. My feeling is that you have to show your homework. And what I mean by that is that if you're going to make a claim, put the data out. We don't do that with everything, but Space Hippie we did. There was a product called Nike Forward that was an apparel garment that we said was 70% less carbon intensive than your traditional fleece. And we put the data out. And so people could debate it, but at least you're being honest about kind of where you came up with it, how you arrived at those conclusions. I think that's the only way that you get there. Unfortunately, the ESG thing or green, the intensity of scrutiny in that space requires you all to be more diligent. You have to kind of pick apart the onion a little bit and see what a company's really about. And it's not always obvious how that happens. And I think to your point about green hushing, with all the regulatory action that's happening now, that is one of the consequences, that you're going to be a lot more deliberate about what you say because you're going to be held accountable, which I think is okay if you're doing the right thing.
So a little follow-up about being held accountable. Do you view carbon credits and purchasing those as something that's part of your net zero plan at all?
No, don't.
Tell us more.
So the Science-Based Target Initiative, which we've signed up for, does not allow you to use carbon credits to get there.
Wow.
So we have not. We've got a couple legacy programs, but they were like done in specific geographies, and they were more kind of a consumer engagement thing. It's the Wild West in carbon credits. I think that there's some really interesting progress in that space, but it's going to have to be regulated in order for it to be a legitimate tool. And it's going to be a legitimate, this is just my opinion, it's going to be a tool that carbon-intensive industries are going to have to use. Think like aluminum smelting, cement manufacturing. They're not going to be able to decarbonize their supply chain in any meaningful way without using carbon credits or offsets.
But you see Nike as able to.
I sure hope so. I mean, I think we have a fighting chance of getting to our science-based targets, but again, it's dependent on variables that we don't control. And so we try to influence them as best we can and hope for a good outcome.
Great. Maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
Sure. Are there certain, you talked a lot about influence. Are there certain teams at Nike that you feel like are easier to influence?
Yes, there are certain teams at Nike that are easier to influence, no question about it. The product teams are easier to influence, which is great because they're the ones that we need to influence. The manufacturing teams are easier to influence, and that's awesome too because we've been on this journey with them for a long time. Nike retail, a little harder, right? They're trying to figure out, they don't make up a meaningful percentage of our carbon footprint. They're more concerned about what does the merchandising layout look like versus, how they're going to communicate to consumers from a sustainability standpoint. They're starting to come around. But yeah, I think that's true in any business. When you're trying to influence anyone, sometimes it's going to be more relevant to them than others.
And Noel was telling me earlier how he has hired on his team someone from all the different departments. So like someone from marketing, who used to work in marketing, is now working on sustainability. And can you share some other examples? I think that's really neat in terms of
innovation, product design,
integration,
ops and logistics. Yeah. So I've really kind of leaned more toward people who have functional expertise that can be supported by a data and analytics team that has the sustainability expertise. As opposed to kind of hardcore sustainability expertise. Now, there's a place for that. You need people who are water experts. We've hired somebody from the Department of Energy who understands kind of regulatory frameworks in different countries as we start to advocate for renewable energy. But in general, I think the more you understand the way a business works or a function works, the more influence you have.
And we've heard this from others, right? That it's helpful to be a generalist if you want to go into sustainability, but have some deep expertise in something. To apply. So, well, thanks, Noel. One final question before we wrap up is just at the end of the day, when you think about everything that we know about climate change and social inequity, what gives you hope?
I'd go back to the innovation stuff that I mentioned earlier. I mean, the amount of money that venture capital, private equity is pouring into alternative materials, sustainable technologies. Nike made a small investment with TPG, which is one of the biggest private equity firms in the world, in their Rise Climate Fund. It was like a $3 billion fund. So we get to see all the things that they're investing in. It's really, really cool. There's some amazing stuff out there. Your lives at my age are going to be really different than my life right now, just in terms of how that stuff impacts your life. And I think there's reason to be optimistic.
Well, that's super exciting. Noel flew all the way here from Oregon just for this fireside chat. So please join me in giving him a round of applause. Thank you so much. This is great.
I'll try.
And please join us. We have a reception outside if you want to mingle, ask some more questions. I think we have another half an hour or so. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Great.
Good.